Something was about to change, not just for a small group of people living on the eastern edge of a vast continent, not just for the men who would pick up guns and march into battle. Something was about to change for the entire world. A new idea was growing, an idea that would shake kingdoms and move history forward. And it all began here, in a place that most people in power had not yet learned to fear. The year was 1775. The land was called the American colonies. 13 of them stretched along the Atlantic coast of North America. To the east was the ocean. To the west was a wilderness that seemed to go on forever. The people who lived here had come from many places. Some came from England, some from Scotland and Ireland, some from Germany and the Netherlands. Some were brought by force from Africa. Some had been here long, before any European ever set foot on this soil. This land held many stories, and all of them were running toward the same moment. Britain was a great power, one of the greatest the world had ever seen. Its navy ruled the seas. Its armies had fought on every continent. Its king sat on a throne that felt, to those who sat on it, like the most natural thing in the world. Power tends to feel that way when you have had it long enough. You start to believe it belongs to you. You start to believe it will never end. But across the ocean, something was shifting. The people living in those 13 colonies had been building their own lives for over 100 years. They had cleared forests. They had built towns and farms and schools. They had buried their dead and raised their children and made a world out of nothing. And slowly, without fully realizing it, they had become something different. They were not quite English anymore. They were not quite anything that had existed before. They were becoming American. They had their own assemblies, their own courts, their own ways of doing things. They had learned to govern themselves, at least in small ways. And they had started to believe that this was right, that people should have a say in the laws that govern them, that no man should tell another man how to live his life without that man having any voice in the matter. The British government did not see it that way. To London, the colonies were useful. They produced goods. They paid taxes. They were part of the empire, and the empire needed to be managed, so laws were passed. Taxes were set. Soldiers were sent. And none of it was decided with any real input from the people who would have to live under those decisions. The tension had been building for years before 1775. There had been protests. There had been pamphlets filled with angry words. There had been moments of violence that both sides remembered differently. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston. 5 people died. The colonists called it a massacre. The British called it self-defense. The truth, as it often does, lived somewhere in between. But the anger on one side was very real. Tea was thrown into Boston Harbor in 1773, a simple act of defiance that carried enormous weight. The colonists refused to pay a tax they had no hand in creating. The British saw this as rebellion. The colonists saw it as principle. Both were right. That is what made it so dangerous. By 1774, both sides were moving towards something neither could fully stop. The British tightened their grip. They closed Boston's port. They sent more soldiers. They tried to squeeze the colonies back into obedience. But squeezing something too hard does not always make it submit. Sometimes it makes it explode. The colonists began to organize. Leaders met in Philadelphia. Ordinary men formed militias. They stored weapons in hidden places. They drilled in fields when the sun went down. They were not yet soldiers. Not yet, but they were becoming something. And somewhere in the cold air of a Massachusetts winter, the first Réal spark was being struck. April 18th, 1775. The night was dark and the roads were long. British soldiers moved quietly out of Boston, heading toward Concord. Their mission was simple: find the weapons the colonists had been hiding, destroy them. A small operation, clean and quick. That was the plan. But the colonists had eyes everywhere. A system of watchers and riders had been set up precisely for a moment like this. When the soldiers moved, word moved faster. 2 riders went out into the night, carrying a message that would wake up a sleeping world. Paul Revere was one of them. His name would be remembered long after most of the soldiers who marched that night had been forgotten. He rode through the darkness, stopping at houses, knocking on doors, calling out that the soldiers were coming. People rose from their beds, grabbed their guns, pulled on their coats. Something deep inside them recognized a moment. This was not a drill. This was not a protest. This was a real thing. By the time the British soldiers reached Lexington at dawn, there were men waiting for them on the village green. Not many, fewer than 80, against several hundred well-trained soldiers of the most powerful military in the world. The odds were not good, and the men standing on that green knew it. No one knows who fired first. That mystery has never been solved, and perhaps it never will be. But shot rang out, then more shots. When it was over, 8 colonists lay dead on the green. 10 were wounded. The British marched on toward Concord, thinking they had won something. They had not yet understood what they had started. At Concord, the British destroyed what supplies they could find, but the colonists had moved most of them already, and now the countryside was awake. Armed men were pouring out of farms and forests and villages for miles around. They were not a professional army. They did not wear uniforms or march in perfect lines. They moved through the trees behind stone walls, along the edges of roads. They used the land the way you use something you have known your whole life. The British march back to Boston became something close to a nightmare. All along the road, shots came from places the soldiers could not see. Men fell. The march became a retreat. The retreat became a desperate run. By the time the soldiers reached safety, almost 300 of them had been killed or wounded. The colonists had made their point. The news spread through the colonies like fire through dry grass. Lexington and Concord became names that meant something. They meant that ordinary men could stand up to the most powerful military force on earth. They meant that the moment people had been preparing for and dreading had finally arrived. There was no going back now. The Continental Congress met in Philadelphia and faced the truth. They needed an army, a real one, someone to lead it. They looked at the men available and chose a tall, quiet Virginian named George Washington. He was not the most brilliant man in the room. He was not the most eloquent. But he had something that the situation demanded more than brilliance or eloquence. He had steadiness. He did not panic. He did not give up. In the years ahead, those qualities would prove more valuable than anyone could predicted. Washington took command of the army outside Boston in the summer of 1775. What he found there was difficult to describe without making it sound impossible, because it nearly was. The men were brave enough, but they had almost no training, no uniforms, no standard weapons. Some of them had signed up for a few months and were already thinking about going home. The camp was disorganized. Disease moved through it the way disease always moves through places where too many people live too close together. Washington looked at all of this and began to build. Slowly, patiently. He knew he could not rush. He knew the British were better trained, better supplied, better organized. He could not beat them by playing their game. He had to play a different game, a game of patience and endurance, and making the cost of winning too high for the other side to bear. While Washington organized, the fighting continued. In June of 1775, British forces tried to push colonial militiamen off a hill overlooking Boston Harbor. The colonists had fortified the position overnight, and the British were shocked when they arrived in the morning to find it occupied. They attacked. Twice they were driven back. The third time they reached the top, but only because the colonists ran out of ammunition. The battle was called Bunker Hill, though much it was actually fought on a neighboring hill called Breed's Hill. The names do not matter as much as what the battle showed. The British had won the ground, but they had lost over 1,000 men. The colonists had lost fewer than half that many. And the colonists had shown something important. They could stand up to professional soldiers in a real battle. They could hold their ground. They could make the price of attacking them very high. The winter of 1775 into 1776 was a time of preparation and waiting. Washington worked to shape his collection of farmers and tradesmen and hunters into something that resembled an army. He imposed discipline. He dealt with shortages of food and clothing and weapons. He wrote letter after letter to Congress, asking for things he desperately needed. Some of those letters were answered. Many were not. Meanwhile, something powerful was happening in the world of ideas. A man named Thomas Paine published a small pamphlet called Common Sense in January of 1776. It said things that many people had been feeling, but had not yet said out loud. It said that kings were not natural or right or necessary. It said that government should serve the people, not the other way around. It said that independence was not just a possibility. It was a duty. The pamphlet spread everywhere. People read it in taverns and churches and in the fields. It was written in plain language that anyone could understand. It did not speak to scholars or to the powerful. It spoke to ordinary people. And ordinary people responded to it in a way that ordinary people respond when someone finally says what they've been thinking but were afraid to say. They felt recognized. They felt that their instincts were correct. They felt brave enough to act. By the spring of 1776, the idea of independence had moved from being a fringe thought to being something most people in the colonies could imagine. Not everyone supported it. There were still many loyalists, people who wanted to remain part of Britain. Some of them had deep roots in the colonies. Some of them had family ties to England. Some of them simply feared what revolution would bring. Fear of change is one of the oldest and most powerful forces in human life. But the momentum was with the independence movement. And in June of 1776, the Continental Congress took up the question directly. A committee was formed to write a document that would explain to the world why the colonies were breaking away from Britain. Thomas Jefferson was given the task of drafting it. He was 33 years old. He sat down in a rented room in Philadelphia and began to write. What he produced was not just a declaration of separation. It was a statement about what human beings deserved, about what government was supposed to be for. It began with words that still echo today, words about all men being created equal, about rights that could not be taken away. It was a vision of the world as it should be, written by a man who lived in the world as it was, a man who owned enslaved people even as he wrote about freedom. That contradiction would not be resolved that day. It would not be resolved for a very long time. But the words were there, and words, once written, have a way of outlasting the failures of the people who write them. On July 4th, 1776, the Congress approved the Declaration of Independence. Bells rang. People cheered. Bonfires were lit. Something that had been building for years had finally been given its formal name. This was no longer a dispute between the colonies and the mother country. This was a revolution. But declaring independence and achieving it were two very different things. The British were not simply going to accept this document and sail away. They were going to fight. And in the summer of 1776, the full weight of British military power began to arrive on American shores. The British commander was General William Howe. He was a capable soldier with a great army and a great navy. He landed his forces on Long Island in August of 1776 with the intention of crushing the revolution quickly and cleanly. Washington's army was positioned on Brooklyn Heights, and what followed was one of the worst days of the war for the American cause. The British outmaneuvered Washington completely. They found an unguarded road, swept around the American flank, and caught Washington's men in a terrible position. The battle was a disaster. Hundreds of Americans were killed or captured. The rest were trapped with the East River at their backs. It looked like the end. But here is where something strange and remarkable happened. A fog rolled in, thick and complete, the kind of fog that makes the world disappear. And under that fog, Washington did something extraordinary. He moved his entire army, thousands of men, across the river in the darkness and the mist, using every boat that could be found. By morning, when the fog lifted and the British advanced to finish the job, they found the heights empty. The Americans were gone. The British took New York. Washington's army retreated north, then west into New Jersey. The situation was grim. Men were deserting. The enlistment periods of many soldiers were running out. Congress was in a panic. Some people began to wonder if the revolution was already over before it had truly begun. Washington watched his army shrink and felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. He was not a man who showed his fear easily, but the letters he wrote during those weeks carried something heavy in them. A recognition that the cause was close to dying, and a determination not to let it die. He needed a victory, something to show the country and his soldiers that this fight could still be won. And in the darkness of Christmas night, 1776, he found his moment. The Delaware River was choked with ice. The night was brutally cold. Any sensible military commander would have stayed in camp and waited for better conditions. Washington chose a different path. He moved his army through the ice and the cold and the dark, crossing the river in the dead of night, and struck the Hessian forces at Trenton, New Jersey, before dawn on December 26. The Hessians were German soldiers hired by the British to help fight the war. They were professionals. They were experienced. They were also completely surprised. The attack came out of nowhere, and whether they had not expected any sane army to move through. The battle was over in less than an hour. The Americans captured over 900 soldiers and suffered almost no casualties of their own. The effect was immediate and enormous. A revolution that had seemed on the verge of collapse suddenly felt possible again. Soldiers who had been about to go home re-enlisted. New volunteers came forward. The story of Washington crossing the Delaware in the ice and the dark became one of the great stories of the war. It showed something important about the man and about the cause. They could survive the worst. They could come back from the edge. 1777 was a year of two very different stories happening at the same time. In the North, something was going wrong for the British. General John Burgoyne led a large army south from Canada with the plan of cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies. It was a bold strategy on paper. In reality, it fell apart. The American wilderness was not kind to Burgoyne's army. Supply lines stretched and broke. The terrain was difficult. American forces under Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold fought the British to a standstill at Saratoga, New York, in two bloody battles. Finally, in October of 1777, Burgoyne had no choice. He surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. Saratoga was a turning point that changed the entire nature of the war, because it was not just a victory on a battlefield. It was a signal to the rest of the world. France had been watching the revolution with great interest. The French hated the British with the deep hatred that comes from centuries of competition and war. They wanted to see Britain humiliated, but they were not going to risk backing a losing cause. Saratoga showed them that the Americans could win, that this revolution was not going to collapse in a season. And so, in early 1778, France officially entered the war on the American side. This changed everything. The British suddenly had to worry about their navy being challenged. They had to think about their Caribbean colonies being attacked. They had to fight on multiple fronts at once. The war that had been about containing a colonial rebellion became a global conflict. Spain would enter on the American side not long after. The Netherlands would also be drawn in. Britain found itself stretched thin across the world. The American Revolution had become something much bigger than it started out being. While all of this was happening on the grand strategic level, Washington's army was enduring its most famous and terrible winter. Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, from December 1777 to June 1778. The name has become a symbol of suffering and endurance, and the strange thing that happens to people when they share hardship together. The conditions were beyond difficult. Food was scarce. Clothing was inadequate for the brutal cold. Shelter was basic at best. Disease was everywhere. Men died not from enemy bullets, but from the cold and from sickness and from hunger. Washington wrote letters that described the situation in plain terms. His men were starving. They were barefoot in the snow. They needed help. Some help came, but not enough. What carried the army through that winter was not supplies. It was something harder to name. A belief that what they were doing mattered. A refusal to be broken by suffering. Washington walked through the camp every day. He visited the sick. He showed his face to the men who were barely holding on. He did not pretend things were fine when they were not, but he also did not show despair. And somehow, that steadiness held things together. A Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge in February of 1778. He was a complicated man with an inflated resume, but he had real military knowledge and a gift for training soldiers. He began working with Washington's army immediately. He could not speak English. He would bark commands in German and French, and his aide would translate. When the men made mistakes, which they did constantly at first, he would shout and curse fluently in every language he knew. The men thought this was hilarious. They adored him, and under his instruction, they began to transform. They learned to march properly, to handle their weapons correctly, to move as a unit rather than as a collection of individuals. By the time the army left Valley Forge in the spring, it was a different force than the one that had stumbled in. The spring and summer of 1778 saw the British shift their strategy. With France now in the war, they could no longer focus all their attention on the north. They began to move their operations to the south, where they believed there were more loyalists who would support them and where the geography might work in their favor. The war in the south was different from the war in the north. It was more brutal in some ways, more personal. There were communities where neighbors fought neighbors, where the revolution was also a civil war between people who had known each other their whole lives. It was a messier, uglier kind of fighting than the pitched battles of the north. Raids and ambushes and revenge attacks and counter-revenge attacks. The kind of violence that leaves a community scarred long after the armies have moved on. The British had significant early success in the South. They captured Savannah, Georgia, in December of 1778. They captured Charleston, South Carolina, in May of 1780. This was one of the worst American defeats of the war. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers were captured in a single stroke. Washington could not afford losses like that. In the summer of 1780, the Americans tried to counter with a force under General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga. At Camden, South Carolina, Gates was completely routed. His army was shattered. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in American military history. Gates himself fled the battlefield on a horse, riding north so fast that it became a subject of bitter jokes among the soldiers he had abandoned. Things in the South looked very dark. And then something happened that was not a battle, or a siege, or a strategic decision. A man named Benedict Arnold, one of the bravest and most effective American generals of the war, the man who had done so much at Saratoga, tried to betray the revolution. Arnold had grievances, some real, some imagined. He felt he had not been given the recognition and promotion he deserved. He was in debt. His second wife came from a loyalist family. He had been in secret contact with the British for some time, and in the fall of 1780, he tried to hand over the American fort at West Point, a crucial stronghold on the Hudson River, to the British. The plot failed. The British contact, a man named John Andre, was captured carrying documents that revealed everything. Arnold escaped to a British ship before he could be arrested. He spent the rest of the war fighting for the British and the rest of his life in a kind of exile, despised by both sides. His name became synonymous with betrayal, a traitor, the worst thing a revolutionary could be called. But the South was not finished. After the disaster at Camden, Washington sent a new commander south. Nathanael Greene was not a glamorous figure. He had been a Quaker before the war. He had a bad knee that caused him to walk with a slight limp. He had educated himself from books rather than from a military academy. But he was one of the sharpest military minds in the American Army. Greene arrived in the South in December 1780 and quickly understood that he could not beat the British commander, Lord Cornwallis, in a straight fight. So he did not try. He split his forces. He moved constantly. He made Cornwallis chase him across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. He fought where he chose to fight and retreated when he chose to retreat. The Battle of Cowpens in January of 1781 was one of the most brilliantly planned and executed engagements of the entire war. The American commander Daniel Morgan lured the British cavalry commander Banastre Tarleton into a trap so perfectly set that the British force was almost completely destroyed. It was a masterpiece of tactics by a man who had never been to military school. At Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781, Greene fought Cornwallis directly and lost the field. But Cornwallis's army was so badly damaged in the process that it could not continue operating effectively in the South. Cornwallis began moving north into Virginia, looking for a way to consolidate his position. He did not know yet that he was walking toward the end. Virginia in the summer of 1781 was the scene of raids and countermoves and the beginning of something that neither side fully understood yet. Cornwallis moved his army to Yorktown, a small tobacco port on a peninsula where the York River meets the Chesapeake Bay. He chose a position because he expected the British Navy to be able to supply and support him there. The ocean was Britain's great advantage. As long as the Navy controlled the water, Cornwallis could not be cut off. But the French Navy had other ideas. In September 1781, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse fought the British fleet in the waters just outside the Chesapeake Bay. The Battle of the Chesapeake was not the largest naval battle of the age, but it was perhaps the most important. The French did not destroy the British fleet. They did not need to. They simply drove it away. The British ships withdrew to New York. The Chesapeake Bay was now controlled by France. Cornwallis was trapped. He had land on 3 sides and water on the 4th, and now that water was controlled by his enemies. And moving toward him from the north was something he had not expected. Washington had been near New York, threatening the British there. But when word came that de Grasse had secured the bay, Washington moved his army south with remarkable speed, covering hundreds of miles in just a few weeks. French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau moved with him. When Washington arrived outside Yorktown in late September 1781, he had Cornwallis surrounded, American and French forces on the land, the French Navy on the water. Cornwallis had no good options. He could try to break through the encircling forces, but his army was too weakened and outnumbered. He could wait for relief from New York, but that relief would never come because the British Navy could not get past de Grasse. He could surrender. The siege of Yorktown was not casual. It was brutal and precise. American and French cannons fired day and night. Trenches were dug closer and closer to the British defenses. 2 key British defensive positions, called redoubts, were stormed in the night of October 14th by American and French assault parties. One of the American assault columns was led by a young officer named Alexander Hamilton, who would later shape his country in a very different kind of arena. By October 17th, 1781, Cornwallis was finished. He sent out a flag of truce. 2 days later, on October 19th, the British Army marched out of Yorktown to surrender. Cornwallis himself claimed to be ill and sent a subordinate in his place. It may have been illness. It may have been that he simply could not bring himself to hand his sword to George Washington. Whatever the reason, it was a small piece of theater at the end of an enormous drama. The British band played a tune called The World Turned Upside Down. The name was perfect, because that is exactly what had happened. The most powerful military nation on earth had been defeated by an army of farmers and tradesmen and hunters and rebels. The world had indeed been turned upside down. But Yorktown was not technically the end of the war. Fighting continued in some places. The British still held New York and Charleston. Peace negotiations moved slowly. It was not until September 1783 that the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally ending the war and confirming American independence. Britain recognized the United States of America as a sovereign nation. It was a sentence that would have seemed impossible to most people just a decade before. The war had lasted 8 years from the first shots at Lexington to the signing of the peace treaty. In those 8 years, somewhere between 25,000 and 70,000 Americans died, the range reflecting how difficult it is to count the dead in a war that happened so long ago and was fought across such a wide area. Disease killed more than battle. That was true of almost every war of that era. Soldiers were far more likely to die of typhus or dysentery or smallpox than of a musket ball. The British lost many thousands as well. And the Hessian soldiers, Germans who had nothing personal at stake in this conflict, died far from home in someone else's war. And the Loyalists, Americans who had supported the British, faced a grim future in the new nation. Tens of thousands of them left. They went to Canada, to Britain, to the Caribbean. They lost their property, in many cases. They lost their communities. They were the people history tends to forget because they were on the losing side. And then there were the enslaved people. The Revolution's great, unanswered contradiction. The Declaration of Independence spoke of all men being created equal, but the men who signed it included slaveholders. The new nation would be built on that contradiction. Some enslaved people had fought in the war on both sides. The British had promised freedom to enslaved people who left their American masters and joined British forces. Many had done so when the British left. Some of those people went with them to Canada, to Britain, to uncertain futures. The ones who stayed faced a nation that had declared freedom for some while maintaining slavery for others. That wound would not heal. It would not even be addressed, not truly, for another 80 years. And when the addressing finally came, it would come in the form of the bloodiest war in American history. But that is another story. This story is about the beginning. What did the Revolutionary War actually accomplish? It created a nation. That sounds simple, but it was not. The act of creation was messy and complicated and left enormous problems unsolved. But it established something. It established that human beings could choose their own government, that they did not have to accept the authority that history and birth and power had assigned to them, that they could write down what they believed and then try to build a world that matched it. The ideas of the revolution spread. They crossed the Atlantic back to France, where they fed the flames of a revolution that would shake all of Europe. They spread to Latin America, where independence movements would eventually break the grip of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. They spread through the centuries, carried by people who had never heard of Lexington or Concord or Valley Forge, but who understood the core idea, that people deserved to live in freedom, that government existed to serve the people, not the other way around. The men who made the revolution were not saints. They were complicated human beings with flaws and ambitions and contradictions. Washington owned enslaved people. Jefferson owned enslaved people. Many of the founding fathers did. They wrote about freedom while denying it to others. That is a truth, and it should not be hidden or excused. But the ideas they wrote down were larger than the men who wrote them. Those ideas had a life of their own. They kept growing long after the men who first expressed them were gone. George Washington himself did something remarkable after the war. He gave up power. He had led the victorious army. He was the most respected man in the new nation. Some people wanted to make him a king. He refused. He went home to his farm. When the country needed him again, he came back, served 2 terms as the first president, and then stepped down willingly, setting a precedent that would shape American democracy for centuries. The willingness to give up power when the time comes is one of the rarest and most valuable things in political life. Washington had it, and it mattered enormously. The revolution was not just a military event. It was a revolution of ideas. It said something new about what human beings were capable of, not just in fighting and sacrifice, which human beings have always been capable of, but in imagining a different kind of world and then trying to build it, in writing down principles and then attempting, however imperfectly, to live by them, in arguing and debating and compromising and going on arguing again, not because argument is pleasant, but because agreement through argument is more durable than agreement through force. The 13 colonies became 13 states. Then the states became a nation that would grow and change and struggle and fail and try again, a nation that would fight more wars, some of which it would regret, a nation that would make promises it could not always keep and ideals it could not always live up to, but a nation that kept those ideals alive, kept returning to them, kept arguing about what they meant and who they included and how to get closer to them. The road from Lexington Green in April of 1775 to the Treaty of Paris in September of 1783 was long and dark and full of moments where everything might have collapsed. It survived because of the steadiness of one man and the stubbornness of many others, because of fog on the East River and a crossing on a frozen Delaware and a naval battle in the Chesapeake, because of pamphlets that said what people had been afraid to say and declarations that wrote down what people had been afraid to believe. Because somewhere in the nature of that moment, the people who lived it understood or sensed or simply felt in their bones that what they were doing was larger than themselves, that the stakes were not just about their own freedom, but about what was possible, about what kind of world human beings could build if they were willing to fight for it. The shots fired at Lexington on that April morning were heard, as one man wrote, around the world. That is not an exaggeration. The echoes of those shots are still moving, still reaching places that the men who fired them never heard of, still saying the same thing they said on that misty morning in Massachusetts when a small group of farmers stood on a village green and refused to move. They said that some things are worth standing for, that some ideas are worth dying for, that the world does not have to stay the way it is just because that is the way it has always been, that change is possible, that a new thing can be built, that a people together, choosing together, fighting together, suffering together, enduring together, can do something that no single person and no small group of powerful people could ever do alone. They said that the world could be different, And then they went ahead and made it so. That is the story of the Revolutionary War. Not a perfect story, not a clean story, but a true one, and in its truth, with all its complications and failures and unresolved contradictions. It is one of the most powerful stories that has ever been lived. The war ended, the new nation began, and the world was never quite the same again. The question it left behind was not whether freedom was possible. It had proven that. The question was whether freedom could be shared, whether the ideals written down in those founding documents could be extended to everyone who lived under them, whether the revolution would keep going, keep deepening, keep including more and more people in its promises. That question has never been fully answered. It is still being asked. It will probably always be asked, and that, in its own way, is the most revolutionary thing of all. Not that the question was settled, but that it was asked, and that it goes on being asked, generation after generation, each one inheriting the struggle and carrying it forward a little farther. The men on Lexington Green did not win the revolution in a single morning. They just refused to let it end before it had a chance to begin. And in doing so, they gave the world something it did not know it was waiting for. A chance.